France. Okay? But if you get on an airplane, fly to France, it'll take you about 10 minutes to figure it out. Right? So I don't know why we have such a hard time, but economists have a hard time with lots of stuff. So anyway, so why is it, okay, that they come? Well, they come because they're going to be entrepreneurs. Even if they don't start a company, they're going to be entrepreneurs within another firm, doing those types of things. So this idea of brain drain has generated this small business environment, okay, that has been the engine of growth for a century now. And if you think about job creation, so that's been the big topic for the last 2 years, right? So between 80 and 2000, that 20-year period, all net job growth in the U.S. came from small companies. Did big companies hire more people? Sure they did, but they also laid people off. Okay, so large employers were about even over that 20-year period. All of the job growth was substantial in that period, huge, in fact, millions of jobs created. All of it came from small business. Productivity growth. Okay, so over this 30-year period, we increased our productivity by 40%. We were ahead of the world in 1980. Right? There was lots of stories in 1980. You're too young to remember this, of course, but there's lots of stories in 1980 about Japan going to overtake the United States. And so, well, they're now almost 20 years into what they were at one time calling the lost decade. Anyway, so, but over that 30-year period, a 40% increase in productivity. What that means is that when Toby wakes up tomorrow and goes to work, okay, whatever he could do in 1980, he can do 1.4 times that now. So per worker, per labor hour, we can produce 40% more. We're also producing it greener, okay, lower carbon footprint, if that's what you're concerned about, less waste, all those types of things. It's been nothing short of a miracle. Okay, and since in between 96 and 2003, okay, we just spurted ahead of the rest of the world. Right? And what about innovation? Of course, larger firms, great life-changing innovations come from small companies very frequently. I actually have a list of them in here, but I've hidden that just because we're a little short on time. So, if we have immigrants coming to the United States, as well as our own, right? They're coming here, and we're starting these small businesses, and these small businesses are being successful, and they're creating wealth in our country, which does all these good things for us. Why is it here? Okay, why don't they go to Mexico? Okay, basically, well, in some senses, Mexico would have a better natural resource base than we would, depending on what you were looking at, right? On a per acre basis. Well, this is what most economists revert to here is what's called a fertile soil argument. Okay? And that is that innovation, entrepreneurs, good ideas flow to where the soil is most fertile. Okay? That's where they're going to be able to grow. You plant your tree in fertile soil. Okay, well, what is it that makes fertile soil? And this is sort of the heart of my presentation, and that is low taxes. Why? Because then, if you are successful, okay, you work hard, you take risks, all those sort of things, you're successful, you'll be rewarded. You can garner for you and for your family the spoils of your innovation, right? And that is the incentive system, that is the basis on which regular individualism depends. You also have to be able to take risks. Okay, it's going to attract people that are ambitious, that want to do well. Low barriers, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this, but the idea of go to Bangalore and try to start a new company. Right? Okay, well, one, you better buy a house because you're going to be there a long time, and you better bring a big barrel of money because it's going to be really hard to get that done. All right? So we have low barriers to entry, and we have great capital markets. And so good ideas need to be funded. Okay, well, we are the all-time grand champion at funding good ideas. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. So let's look at each of these kind of quickly. Okay, so first of all, taxes. Do not be fooled. If you go to Google, type in tax rates and growth. Okay, I was just very disappointed that the liberal agenda controls this particular search. So they come up with lots of silly stuff about lack of evidence. So they talk about the fact that tax rates were high in the 1950s in the United States, and growth was also high. And they'll say, look, there's no relationship. And I got a Facebook friend that sent this to me, and okay, I immediately defriended him. No, I'm just kidding. I don't defriend liberals. But anyway, said, well, if tax rates were high in the 50s and growth were high, then obviously tax rates and growth are not related. Okay? Well, This was the 1950s. The boys were all back from the war. The population was growing. We had the second wave of mechanization from all the technology that was developed during the Second World War. There's nothing we could have done in the 1950s that would have impaired our growth, right? That was our emergence as a superpower. Okay, so this is not a very good example. Okay, comparing average growth and average tax rates is meaningless, right? So what we need is to think of marginal tax rates. So it's not the average that matters, it's what happens at the margin that's going to be important. And so remember that when we talk about taxes, no one's arguing that if we keep taxes low, that alone will spur growth, because there's a number of things, right? It's the idea that we need innovative, hard-working people. Okay? We need to have free our economic engine from the bounds of regulation, or at least from onerous regulation, so that they can make good decisions that are going to be important. But there's lots of factors. One of the dominant ones, however, is tax rate. Also, in the 1950s, there's this, in economics, is what we call an endogeneity problem, meaning that the two things go together. So when do you think the politicians can slip in a tax increase? When times are bad, or when times are good? Well, when times are good, we're all fat and happy, right? I mean, we're 10 feet tall and bulletproof. If they're doing that in Washington, oh, well, I got so much money, I don't care anyway. Okay, but today, in today's environment, try a tax increase. Okay? So when you see taxes going up during, an economic swell, well, there's this sort of moral hazard that comes from the government that makes those two things look like they go together when in fact they don't. And of course, if taxes and stimulus spending made for great economics, we'd all be wanting to move to Greece, right? So they're the grand champions of it, right? Okay, so the real story here, since the late 1960s, there has been a tax revolution on the planet. Okay, so most developed countries have cut their tax rates, including ours. Okay, and why? Because there is overwhelming evidence that low taxes create growth. So I'm essentially here to tell you that your mother was wrong, which is always a hard thing to do. So how many of you in here had your mother tell you that there's no such thing as a free lunch? Did your mother ever say that? Yeah. Okay, so all mothers say that, right? Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm mapping my experience onto you. But anyway, there actually is a free lunch, not in a microeconomic sense, but in a macroeconomic sense. Lower tax rates create growth. Go back in this country 30 years, keep the tax rates high, okay, slow down the growth, and then look at government revenues today. Okay? If there's a smaller economy, there's less tax revenue and there's less money for all the social programs that people would want to institute, right? So this is, in effect, a free lunch for our economy. We just have to realize that it's there. Consider the holdouts. Okay? Anybody wanting to move to Japan or Scandinavia for economic reasons? Okay? I don't think anyone's impressed with those economies. Okay, so now, but let's think about it. So we have a president who would argue we're already rich. Maybe it's time to cash in our wealth and equalize outcomes in our society, those types of things. So maybe instead of having 2.5% growth, maybe we ought to increase taxes. Okay? And we know that's going to impair growth. That's, President Obama understands that. But is there a big difference between 1 and 2.5%? I mean, so if you're making $100 a day, Toby, next year you make 101 versus 102.50. That probably doesn't sound like too big a deal, right? But think about this. Think about what's good. You guys are all at the beginning of your career, right? So you've got your children, and ultimately your grandchildren that are going to be involved. So if you ask median household income today is $50,000, what's going to happen over one individual's working life? Okay, what's the difference between 1% and 2.5%? Okay, well, if we start at $50,000 today, it grows over your working life, about from the time you're 20 to the time your Social Security kicks in at 47. You have a whole other debate on Social Security. Anyway, that 47 years, this is, by the way, real. That means inflation adjusted. So 2.5% real growth, incomes are going to be $160,000 a year. If you have 1% growth, they're going to be half that. Right? So over one individual's working life, we're talking about the average income in real terms doubling over the alternative between 1 and 2.5%. That's a huge outcome, right? Think back, Toby, sorry to pick on you again, but think back to you when your grandfather was the one making these decisions. Okay? What if they had decided, oh, let's go ahead and go with the liberal state, we're going to have higher taxes, we're going to try to equalize income. Then today, what that means that today, instead of having $50,000 average income, we'd have $25,000 income. You want to live on half of what you're living on now? I personally don't. All right. So anyway, and if you want to fund social programs, do you want to? So think of it from the government's point of view. Do you want to tax 160,000 real dollars, or do you want to be taxing $80,000? Well, if I'm a tax and spend bureaucrat, this is what I want to be taxing, right? There's much more in the way of government revenues as we push this, pay it forward one generation, 20 years, if you have higher growth, right? So what about fairness? So this is, and I need to hurry up here, but there's this famous clip of somebody bringing this up to President Obama. Well, if you cut tax rates, it increases revenues to the government. And he says, it's not about revenue, it's about fairness. All right, so I just got that video clip circled back around to me last week, all right? So what about fairness, all right? Well, here's the distribution of income in the United States, all right? So the top 1% earns 19% of the income, okay? The top 25% earns 66% of the income. The bottom 50%, 13% of the income, all right? Now, most of this is explained by age. It's also on a household explained by number of full-time employees, so if you and your spouse work, those types of things. But nonetheless, so this is the most unequal distribution of income of any country in the world. Of course, you have to think, well, look, China and India have very unequal distribution of income since their economic boom, right? Compare that to Ethiopia, okay, who has very little inequality. How many people do you see wanting to move from India to Ethiopia? Right? I'm not sure that equality is necessarily a great thing. But this is the distribution of income. What about the distribution of tax burden? Okay? Well, look at this. Okay? The top 1% earns 19% of the income. They pay 37% of the taxes. The top quarter earns 66%. They pay 85% of the taxes. Right? So if you got rid of these top quarter, those are the people that are mobile, by the way, okay, then what does that mean everybody else has to pay in order to support the social programs, infrastructure, all that sort of stuff? Okay, so the bottom 50% pays 3%. If you are in the second decile, between 10 and 20%, you pay effectively 0. If you're in the bottom decile, you have a negative tax rate. Okay, we're paying you to live in this country. All right, and the trend. What about President Bush's tax cut? After he decreased taxes, the percent paid by the top 1% increased from 31 to 37. Okay? Why? Because it facilitated, one, a lot more entrepreneurship, a lot more innovation, but it also reduced the need for tax evasion strategy, not tax evasion, tax avoidance strategies, right? So I can avoid paying taxes for a very long time. I do real estate stuff. So I get to choose when I pay taxes. Okay? Well, same thing here with the other people, or